Mic check, 1, 2.
Not because I not because I knew it first and said yes, that's right, but just by the natural flow of the way I think and write and all that kind of stuff. So well, good evening. I think I'm live right now, something like that. For those of you who have zero idea the little chitter chatter that's going on, we're talking down front about the Oxford comma. Yes, that's exactly right. Come on a Wednesday night and we'll talk about all sorts of little minutia of grammar and language and all that kind of good stuff. Actually, depending on who you talk to, it's not minutia, right? Oxford comma, it's not minutia. As much as a comma's little, it's a big deal. Yes, it's exactly right. What's that? It could be kind of like that. Yeah. There you go. There you go. You want to go back to James? It's been a while, hasn't it? How long has it been? We were in about 5 years ago. Was that back in there too? Yeah. All right. Your first year here, Paul? Okay. All right. We are in 1 Corinthians 11, and we paused essentially at verse 10. So we're going to lead into verse 10, and then we're going to somewhat start with one of Christine's questions that she left off with last week. That was you. What's up with the angels? Right? And then your other question was, what is this nature thing and long hair? But nature. How does nature teach us about long hair? Right? Does that make sense? Those are your two questions, if I remember. So we'll start with the first one because it's verse 10, and then we'll get to the other one. All right, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then we'll jump right in. God, we are grateful to you for your kindness, your blessings to us in so many different ways. You favor us, and it comes out of your grace, which means it's all undeserved. Lord, I'm grateful that you are a gracious, benevolent God who is not only all-powerful, but actively at work in our lives in ways we see and we realize, and many times in ways that we don't. Lord, I pray that you would guide us and direct us even by our time together in the Word through the Spirit of God who is at work in us. And I pray, Lord, that you give us understanding and even a joy in sharing together in the Word, around the Word, and in prayer. Bless even in those other groups as they're getting together to chat about the Word, to discuss it, to understand its impact in their lives, to seek to apply it to their lives, to be doers of the Word and not hearers only. And I pray, Lord, that you bless us in the doing. We pray this in Jesus' name, amen. All right, 1 Corinthians 11, I'm going to read verse 2 through verse 16. And one question to kind of throw out there right away, don't answer it now, but just let it stew, okay? Near the end of our time, I want to start exploring, maybe not just start, but completely explore, what do we do with this text for today, okay? What does it mean to take the theological principle that I think in many ways becomes fairly obvious in this text and understand it rightly applied in our day and age? Okay, so that's the question to be stewing over the next several moments. Okay, start in verse 2. Follow along as I read out loud. Verse 2 through verse 16. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or to shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is disgraced for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. So just as a little entry into this text, again, a review. We're talking about a practice. Paul's talking about a practice within a particular cultural setting of wives, especially as I see in this text, I think of wives covering their heads. The question is that head covering like a shawl or a hood, or is it their long hair that is done up in a certain way, a hairstyle? While they participate within the prayer or the prophecy or the worship gathering of God's people within the church, and all of this demonstrates and supports or upholds the enduring principle of role relationships or authority and submission. So let me just draw your attention to verse 6 again. I've been thinking about this. I mentioned last time we got together that of the two major things that head coverings could be, a shawl or a hood or hair that is done up, both of them could be argued from the text. But I'm slightly inclined to think that it's a shawl or a hood or something like that. However, I looked at it again today, And now I don't know. How do you like that? Now I don't know. So let me give you a few of my rationalizations, my thinking, my reasonings through this. And then, this is not always the case with every single text, but then you can decide for yourself what you think it is, okay? Now, I say that with a smile on my face because, again, we don't do this with everything. But in a case where it is a little bit ambiguous and really the practical outworking isn't the most important thing, it's the theological principle undergirding the whole thing, then we can get that right and see how it works itself out. So, you look at verse 6, and according to verse 6, Paul says, "For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short." So as I look at verse 6 in talking about being covered doesn't seem to be saying that her hair is the covering. That's the way I look at verse 6. Okay? I'm somewhat repeating some observations from last time around. So according to verse 6, it appears like the covering is something more than simply her hair. Okay? Verse 10. You look at verse 10, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. We'll get further involved in verse 10 in just a moment. But literally, Joel, you have New American Standard, is that correct? Can you read for me verse 10 out loud, and then tell me if anything is in italics in the verse? Oh, I'm sorry. We have Nate. We have the roaming mic. That's right.
Hello?
There we
Okay.
go.
Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And, quote, a symbol of is in italics.
That's exactly right. One of the nice features of the New American Standard versus the ESV or the NIV is that the New American Standard will place in italics words that have been supplied by the translation committee. Does that make sense? So to kind of smooth it out a little bit in our idiomatic English, the translators have said, hey, we think this is what it's getting at, but it actually wasn't in the original manuscripts. So literally, verse 10 reads, "For this reason, the wife ought to have authority on her head." Now, we would probably look at that, scratch your head and say, excuse me? She ought to have authority on her head. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So the NASB and the ESV essentially read the same in verse 10, but the NASB is saying a symbol of has been supplied to help us understand what we think is going on in the text. Does that make sense as far as it goes? Okay. So think with me about this, again, as another kind of possible proof that I think it's head coverings as a shawl or a hood and not simply hair that is done up. In verse 10, the language of something on the head suggests that it's not hair alone or hair that's done up. So something is on the head. So literally having something, authority, on her head. I don't know many people who would look at this and say, yeah, the authority is her hair. That's what it's talking about. So even the very raw language of verse 10 seems to suggest head covering that's not simply hair. Further, look down at verses 14 and 15. Those verses are a little bit tricky. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Now you could look at verse 15, as I think Christine brought out last week. Well, doesn't this seem to throw a monkey wrench in the whole system? He's talking about long hair, and it's a covering. That's possible, which that verse is leading me to think, I wonder if it's not as straightforward as I think it is, right? But what does Paul do in verses 14 and 15? But he actually uses the word long hair. He doesn't use it earlier when he talks about the covering for the woman or the wife. Does that make sense? So it's not as if he didn't use the word before because the word doesn't exist. Does that make sense? The word does exist, and he uses it later in the text. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm saying those are my ways of thinking through where I think it could be shawl or a hood, but then I look at verses 14 and 15, and boy, it sure seems like hair, long hair, hair done up. That could just as easily be the case too. So there we're at. We're in a muddle of a problem right there. How does that sound? So your own pastor says, I'm not quite sure. I looked at it again today, and I'm not sure where I land on this. The good thing is that my salvation is not dependent on this. That's the good thing, and neither is yours. And even the theological principle that is at stake in this text is not at stake because of trying to figure out one or the other. Does that make sense? Okay. Christine.
I mean, obviously not in the inspired, but if I have a footnote on them that says in verses 5 through 13, the Greek word, I can't pronounce it, is translated wife in verses dealing with wearing a veil, a sign of being married in first century culture. Is there a cultural thing here about if you were married, you wore a veil, and if you weren't, you didn't?
Quite possibly.
Does that...
I want to be careful I don't go too far down the weeds of we know for sure the cultural expression of being a married woman was wearing a shawl. I want to be careful I don't go too far down that road. That is possible, though. I mean, in many other cultures, and I think, Kathy, you might have brought this up a couple of weeks ago. I mean, even still today, there are very cultural expressions of a woman being covered not with her hair, but with something else. So it makes sense to me that this head covering was a shawl or something placed over. So I would still lean that way, but I look at verses 14 and 15. Paul specifically talks about long hair as a covering. I think I can argue my case still, understanding verses 14 and 15 the way I do, but man, it's kind of hard. Make sense? So there you go. I don't have a dogmatic answer on that. All right, moving forward? Good. Any other thoughts? Kathy. She has illumination. She's going to bring clarity.
Because I'm confused too, but
Okay.
Is it some sort of analogy where he's using the two instances as a comparison to something else that maybe isn't in the passage?
What would you say he's doing the analogy? What is the analogy?
And the analogy is authority.
Okay.
Okay, so he's comparing these, using these examples as some sort of analogy or comparison to authority, right?
In a way, yes.
I guess I'm
But
kind of confused.
In this case, I would not use analogy.
Maybe comparison is a better word.
I would say this is where we get a little bit dicey. A culturally accepted demonstration of the distinctions between husband and wife. Okay, so it's not necessarily merely a picture or an analogy. Okay, he is actually talking about an actual practice that was known to them, and it appears as you look at this text, accepted in the culture at large.
But he puts it in there so they would understand because of the time and place they were living.
Yes.
But we don't.
Correct. That's exactly right.
And that's what makes it very difficult to
Yes.
interpret.
Mm-hmm.
Am I right following that part?
That's exactly right. And your comments, even about the dilemma of it, lead right into my opening question: what do we do with a text like this for today? And one of the challenges is to recognize to what degree do you lean on cultural norms. You have to be very careful with that. I don't think it would be wise to look at this text and say, well, this was just a cultural thing that they did. Be very careful. If you're not careful, you might convey that to other people, that you just approach this text and say, well, this was cultural, and so we don't need to do this today. Now, if you make a case that wives today within the gathering of God's people don't need to follow Paul's instruction to wear head coverings, how are you going to make that case? Does that make sense? And if you make that case, what are you not going to say? Right? So, I mean, this is challenging. It's really challenging. In fact, this passage probably is like the prototype of all dilemmas when it comes to this sort of thing. in part because it's a little bit ambiguous, and yet it's very strong language that Paul references. Christine.
Well, just back in chapter 8, there was a similarity with the food offered to idols, and there was a cultural component, but the theological basis
Exactly.
is the part that we have to apply. So that's going to come into play here too.
Correct.
Because I've never really been worried about whether the food I've been given is offered to idols. It's not a thing here in America right now.
That's exactly right. And this is going to be rhetorical, so don't answer this. Don't you raise your hand and try to respond to me just yet on this. So there could be, if you're not careful, a too quick, straight-lined approach to a passage like this, where you say, Paul must be meaning all women have to wear head coverings in the church. Or, equally too straightforward is, Paul can't be saying that for me today, so no women have to do that. Both of those are approaching the text wrongly, even if the conclusion we would reach on one or the other might be about the same. Another wrong approach to this text would be to say, Paul must be saying here in this text that no man can have long hair, period. Ugh. Be careful. Be careful. Similarly, a person who has a too quick and straightforward reading of this text could say, hey, Paul is saying that guys always have to take off their hats when they go in the building. Tricky stuff, isn't it? Right? Now, any or all of those may, at some level, come to play when we think about fleshing this text out today. May, but be very careful you don't just jump from point A to point B without having done the careful work. And you might come across questions you can't answer in that careful work. I mean, I say, I don't know quite what the head coverings was that Paul's talking about. Yet, I think I can work through what he's getting at, which therefore thus applies this way to us today. So, we on the same sort of track right now? We good? Okay. So let's move on. Verse 10. This is that fun verse. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. I've already mentioned that a symbol of has been supplied by many even good translations of the Bible, because the raw phrase, she ought to have authority on her head, is a little bit too clunky. What in the world is he talking about? So you look at the text, you look at the context, and even the supply have a symbol of, in my opinion, seems to resonate with what Paul is communicating, right? What's he talking about? Women covering their head, men not covering their head. Women covering their head because they are the glory of man. Man not covering his head because he is the glory of God or Christ, right? And all of this is in the context of the gathered local church. And so Paul is talking about all of these things. So in your mind you're thinking, so what is he getting at? Is some sort of tangible, visible demonstration that a woman is operating in a way that is consistent with God's ordained design for her. Would you agree with that? That's what he's getting at. Some physical demonstration. So it seems reasonable that it is a legitimate supplying a symbol of authority. It can't mean that she has to have her husband sit on her head, right? That's not what Paul is getting at. You think through this? He can't be saying she ought to have a husband to be her authority. I don't think that's what Paul's talking about. So I think it's consistent that what he's getting at, conveying, is that is why she ought to have some sort of demonstration of being in proper alignment under authority. Does that make sense? And that is in parallel with what Paul said in verse 7. A man ought not to cover his head. The parallel statement is verse 10. A wife ought to have authority on her head. Those are parallel statements. So the one helps us with the other, and sometimes vice versa. Does that make sense? So I think the NASB and the ESV are in good, safe territory to have supplied this helpful way to think through what's he talking about, a symbol of authority. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on that part before we get into the angels? Because that's fun. The angels is fun.
So I have a question. I probably won't word it very well, but I feel like there's this giant question lingering out there that no one ever wants to ask, so I'll try.
Go for it, Doug. You're kind of that guy.
So, to demonstrate authority, the symbol is present. It's either long hair or a head covering, one of the two. Why don't we do either? Why has our church and churches like us reached the conclusion of, meh? You know, like with baptism, we're like really concerned not just about the symbolism, but also the mode.
Yes.
Why is that of no concern here?
Yes.
Especially if it, as we just read in this last verse, it's supposed to convey authority. Nor do we have a substitute for it.
Correct. So if I could, I don't think I'm doing an illegitimate punt here, okay? I don't think so. But can we table that to kind of come back around to my opening question? Because that leads us into thinking about what does it look like today to faithfully apply this text to our lives. First level of application is, why don't we actually do what Paul says here? Right? So can we table that for just a couple of more minutes? Is that okay? Is that okay? Because I want to toss that question out initially to everybody else to kind of think through that. How would you work through that? Because that is the elephant in the room when it comes to this text. Right? It is the elephant in the room. Why don't we do that? If we are onto something, or if I'm onto something, that this is talking about a shawl or a hood, none of you women are doing that here, right? If this is something more like long hair or hair done up, we might have some question as to who might be faithfully applying that today, right? And admittedly, this is not trying to offend anybody, so please think the best of me with what I'm about to say, okay? Please think the best of me. You look at this text, and Paul is talking about cutting your hair, shaving your head, long hair. Where does your mind go when you hear all of those things? Well, hold on a second. How short is short? Right? What is long hair really? Right? I need to cut my hair. Like, I really do. I need to cut my hair. It's going to happen soon. I need to cut my hair. Is my hair too long? Is that what Paul is getting at? Right? And if he is, oh man, am I guilty of having too short of hair, too long of hair, too shorn of hair? Right? Those are understandable questions to think about. Again, if we're too straightforward with the text and not carefully working it out. But those relate to the elephant in the room of this passage. They really do. Okay? So, we'll come back to that sooner rather than later. Let's talk about the angels. When Paul says, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority, that is why, I was going to pose this as a question, but I will answer it. That is why is going back to what he just said in verses 7, 8, and 9, not looking ahead to what he says at the end of verse 10. Okay? So a person could look at verse 10 and say, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, ... because of the angels. The reason a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head is because of the angels. That's not what Paul is saying. That is why is referring firstly back to what he talked about with 7, 8, and 9. Because of God's created order, man, then woman. Woman came from man. Paul is very clear with that. Because of that, because man ought not to have a symbol of authority on his head, he should not cover his head, woman ought to. That is why. Does that make sense? So now we lead into the end of verse 10, and he has this additional, expanded understanding of, do you realize the full extent of adhering to these gender distinctions, demonstrating them faithfully in your assembly because of the angels? So now he brings the angels into the picture. What in the world? Does anybody want to take a stab at what Paul is getting at when he says, because of the angels? How does a woman following Paul's instructions here have anything to do with the angels?
This is just really a stab in the dark.
That's fine.
The angels are under God's authority.
You know what? As simple as that is that maybe what it is?
Back to verse 3, when it talks about
Correct.
The chain of authority.
That's exactly right.
And so, because he gives an example. The angels are under God's authority, and so they do nothing outside of what God deems them to do.
Correct.
And that similarly is the man-woman relationship, and it goes back to Christ.
Correct.
And so, I mean, because if he didn't put that in there, then that would always be hanging out there. Well, whose authority are the angels under?
So to paraphrase what Kathy is saying, because of the angels is Paul reminding these believers the angels are under God's authority all the time. And if we were to expand that just a little bit more, I would take Paul to reference the angels as being the good angels. I would not think that he's talking about demons or the unclean spirits as we're told in the gospel accounts. And so with that, do the angels ever fall out of line in the authority structure that God has for them? Do they ever go out of bounds in that regard? No. They're forever going to be following after the authority of God. Okay? Good comment. Good thought, Kathy. Jason.
So here's another shot in the dark, is because angels don't have gender, so they understand it less. In the same sense that angels have a desire to watch humans in salvation because they don't understand it experientially, perhaps they also learn about gender, and they, by extension, since God used gender and marriage as a means of picturing Christ in the church, I mean, by extension, also learning more about how Christ in the church operates. But as we faithfully are careful about gender roles in marriage and in church life, that helps to give a faithful picture of God's design to the angels.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. And you do reference a very legitimate passage, right? The angels peer into this salvation. They, to put it in my paraphrase, they're wondering, what in the world is God doing, right? I mean, I'm not saying that they're thinking that, but they're like, what is going on with these little critters, you know? Crazy. Nate.
I actually have a phone-in question from Jason. He asked if he could ask a question on the live stream. We're going to see if this works.
Well, how about he asked if he could ask a question, so you ask the question, I'll let you know if I want to answer it.
I mean...
Go ahead.
One sec. I'm going to try this. Let's see here. All right. We'll see if this works. You are now on speaker.
Perfect.
We can hear you.
Mm-hmm.
You can ask the question now.
Okay. So, hey guys. Everybody hear this right now?
Yes.
Go for it, J.O.
So, I would be on a similar position to what Christine brought up. I think it's what Paul is doing by mentioning the angels is we've seen this pattern previously. You look at specifically how Jesus handled the issue of divorce and remarriage. He went back to the created order, right from Genesis, and is now making, argumentation for his point. So it's not simply that, a woman should have her head covered. It's what's God's design for this from even before marriage itself existed. And you could say that to some extent, it's a picture of God's pre-Adamic cosmology, I guess you could say, or his order for mankind and for just how the universe itself is supposed to operate. And when a woman, when I think in this case it is talking about specifically when women dress in a more feminine, when women dress in a culturally seen as a feminine fashion, they are demonstrating proper order and submission to their husband. At least that's my take on this. Hopefully it was something worth listening to. I'm really thankful that Nate allowed me the opportunity to try something out of the box with you folks. So just a simple way of saying thank you.
You're welcome, J.O. And for anybody to be out of the box, it's you, right? We all know that, so thank you. I think these comments are really helpful. One kind of amendment onto this is the angels, or at least some classification of angels, can be seen to be something of the, if you want to call it, worship leaders of God around the throne. And if the context we understand here is, broadly speaking, the corporate gathering and worship of God's people, that could be another element of because of the angels. But that doesn't fully answer what's going on, and Paul doesn't fully answer this. One way to think through this is Paul saying because of the angels, meaning all of these or some of these might be true, but they will be offended unless you go along with what I'm saying. Right? They're impacted by what you do. Does that make sense? So it's not simply saying, well, because of the angels. As if, well, they look into what we're trying to do and they're like, I get an idea of what this gender thing might mean. But do we unduly offend them? Is there some impact to the angels by what we do within a local assembly, how we demonstrate our distinctiveness as genders? Does that make sense? Maybe, maybe not, kind of. Paul doesn't add anything further about the angels other than this little phrase, because of the angels. That's all he says. So, a lot of good ideas. I think some of those ideas may stick more than others, or they all sound great. But nonetheless, what this does for me is say, Paul is now heightening the significance of what we do. This is now cosmological. This goes into the cosmos of how you and I live our lives. It impacts in some way, Paul doesn't elaborate how, but it impacts in some way even the angels themselves. Right? They have a relationship with us in a way, so much so that Paul uses them as a leverage point to encourage proper decorum and conduct. All right, let's keep moving on. So, verse 11 and 12, I want you to look at verses 11 and 12, and here's my question. How are these two verses functioning in Paul's instructions? So we have that fantastic little statement in verse 10, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Now, how are verses 11 and 12 functioning? What are they doing in Paul's instruction in the broader context of what he's saying here? What are they doing? Notice what he says. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. How are these two verses functioning? Christine.
Well, I wonder if he's tying back into the created order that back in verse 8,
Okay.
8 and 9. But also kind of adding a next layer of, but keep in mind now men are born from women. Like this isn't, and so then he brings it back to the end of verse 12, and all things are from God.
Yep.
Tying back into verse 3, that passage key. Wait, it's really about God. Don't forget, don't get
Exactly.
lost in the weeds.
So without putting words in your mouth, this is a way for Paul, rightly, theologically, to keep things well balanced, right? This is not like, hey, God's order was man first, then woman, and oh, by the way, woman came from man. Leave that there all by itself. Most of the men in the assembly would be like, you got that right. That's right, yeah. But Paul doesn't do that, right? He says this is true, this is a reality, this is a created order. Oh, but keep this in mind also. In the ESV, and I think the NASB translates it this way too, is so they are not independent of one another. There's a mutuality between male and female, a very balanced mutuality between. Very good. So you've answered well my question, how is it functioning? I think it functions to balance out, not that Paul needed to be balanced out, but balance for our minds and our practices, that there is a blessed and beautiful mutuality here. The Lord, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of the woman. For as woman was made from man, so now man is born of woman, and all things are from God. There is not an hierarchy of actual men, you're just superior all the way through over women. That's not what Paul is saying. That's not what God is saying either. Now go to verse 13. We're getting now into Christine's second question. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Again, I still think that Paul is talking within the context, very defined context of the assembled local church. I don't think this is just at any time if a woman prays to God. I think this is specifically within the context of the gathered local church. So notice that word proper. Some versions might say seemly or fitting. One question that I would have of this, is Paul talking about something that is fitting with regard firstly to God, or fitting with regard especially to a particular context in actual life? Does that make sense? So something could be fitting, something could be appropriate, something could be proper, but it's not firstly about what God thinks is proper. It's proper with what a particular culture thinks is proper. Are there certain cultural norms and expectations virtually anywhere you go? Yes, right? Those aren't necessarily sin or not sin issues by doing them or not doing them. But there could be disgrace and shame by the community if you don't follow what's fitting and proper. Does that make sense? So I raise this because this word may help us understand to some degree, getting back to Doug's question, to what extent do we need to follow the practice of what Paul is saying, or is the practice of what Paul is saying more tied to what was accepted in Paul's culture at the day as an expression of a theological reality? Does that make sense? I'm seeing some eyes go like, staying awake. Is it warm in here? I don't know if it's warm in here. Does that make sense? So I'm just raising this. This word might help us understand, is this proper first with regard to God and his way of doing things, or proper more with regard to what people were accustomed to in Paul's day?
So then is this Paul genuinely asking the question or presenting the question? So after giving this teaching, saying, as long as you're rightly considering all these things, you, the Corinthian church, but also then for all subsequent churches that would be reading this, now judge for yourselves, is it proper to do this because of such cultural things that might differ? So is he genuinely offering this as a question or as a suggestion, you judge for yourselves, or is it a little bit more of a, I don't know, facetious, rhetorical type question? Or
The way, I would say it's more the latter than the former. The question assumes an affirmative. Is it proper for a wife to pray with her head? The question assumes a negative, right? So judge for yourselves, as if to say, you guys know this is true, right? But he's challenging them, think about this, maybe go back to it and think again about it. Isn't this true? Type of a thing. Is it not true? Does that make sense? So look at the rest of verse 14. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? That follows on the heels, verse 15, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So Christine's question last time had to do with, how does nature come into play here, right? So one way to approach the word nature here is to say, is Paul using nature here in the way that we often use nature in reference to God's created world? Like, I grew up Sunday evenings, getting done with Sunday evening church, getting Little Caesars pizza, sitting in front of PBS and watching nature. I loved nature. Eating pepperoni pizza from Little Caesars. I love that. My sisters hated it. But I love that. I love nature. Is that what Paul is saying? Look out in the world and see, you've got the lions there, and you've got the tigers over there, and the bears, oh my. Is he saying that kind of thing with nature? No. What he is saying with regard to nature is more akin to the way we use the word naturally, right? We do this naturally. It's a part of what we typically do. It is our custom. You could even say, to some degree, almost an instinct. Does that make sense? Paul uses this word elsewhere in Romans chapter 2, verse 14, when he talks about those who do not have the law instinctively or naturally do the things in the law. Does that make sense? So he is not using the term nature or naturally to refer to, look at the wild animals, Look at the penguins. Look at two daddy penguins got together and they successfully hatched a baby penguin. I mean, that's in the news these days. I'm serious. That's in the news. Oh, nature teaches us that it must be okay. That's not how Paul is using nature. Does that make sense? Using nature in the sense of it is what we instinctively or naturally do. Does that make sense? So, Christine, does that help a little bit, at least with that first part of your question? Okay? So Paul says, does not it kind of naturally, right, teach us that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace? Now, this is a little bit harder to walk through and wade through. Is Paul firstly or fully saying that nobody is okay with guys having long hair? Is that what Paul's saying? Is he saying that even God's not okay with guys wearing long hair? See, this is where I have to be careful. I mean, you know a little bit, this is biblical minutia. The Nazirite vow, even Samson himself. I mean, Samson, God used Samson and he had really long hair, right? So at minimum, we have to be at least a little bit careful that we don't jump too quickly to say, well, this must mean that God is against men having long hair. But what could we see from this text is that culture to culture, generally speaking, at minimum, have men typically worn shorter hair as opposed to women. Typically. But I think there's even something more going on here. Paul is using, I think, an illustration to help us understand a little bit of that cultural element. What in a culture is a distinguishing feature between men being men and women being women? That's really where he's driving at. That's my understanding of Paul. He's really driving at how does a culture, when it's not on crazy steroids of amoral living and all that kind of stuff, where does a culture say this distinguishes a man is a man and a woman is a woman? How do they demonstrate themselves, right? Even in the realm of long hair and short hair, many cultures have typically demonstrated it that way. That's not the only feature. What are some other features even in our, maybe not current day and age, but going back a couple of decades? You have makeup, you have certain hairstyles, you know what I'm saying? I mean, what makes hairstyles what they are? What makes cosmetics and makeup what they are? I mean, those things inherently, they are what they are, but it's a culture has accepted them to mean something, right? I mean, think about styles come and go every single year. I don't know what the new color was supposed to be for 2022, but there's a color every year. Who decides that? Well, that's a whole nother conversation. Businesses decide that to try to get people to buy their stuff. Yeah, whatever. But a culture has said this is what it generally includes to be distinctly a man and distinctly a woman. And even in our crazy mixed up culture, do you realize that that's still embedded in the fabric of how we live? So much so, pardon the phrase, that our culture knows that drag is unique. Still to this day. It might be praised in some concepts, in some contexts, but they still recognize it is different. Right? And for much of the last several decades, drag was not looked upon with great praise. It was looked upon with a lot of actually disdain. In the context of this passage, with a lot of shame. Right? Okay? Makes sense? Any other questions about that? I mean, I know there's a lot that we could probably try to grapple with and unpack here. Is Paul saying that all women have to have long hair, longer than men? You could go down that road and try to extract that from the text, but I think that's pressing it too far. I would say what Paul is getting at, ultimately, enduringly, is what do I need to do in the presentation of myself to distinctly be a man, and especially a godly husband to my wife, and she is distinctly a woman and a godly wife to me as her husband, right? So how could I present myself in ways that blur that? How could I both by presentation and conduct present myself within a public setting like our church gathering in a way that might not be obvious. Does that make sense? That's what I think Paul is getting at. Okay? Oh man, we're overtime. I wanted to get back to Doug's question. What's that? Go ahead. Let's get back to Doug's question, okay? So you heard my little spiel there, if you could call it a spiel, not a glockenspiel. You heard my little spiel. How would you answer Doug's question then? How would you think through that, right? How would you think through answering Doug's question? And Doug's question stands not just as Doug's question, but a legitimate question on the text. I see that. So anybody want to take a stab at answering Doug's question? Paul does. So why shouldn't Jamie have a shawl on? All of that kind of stuff.
Forgive me for answering a question with a question, but I mean, I heard Daniel also saying it, but like does verse 16 kind of answer that? Is it saying that like this is kind of an argument from Paul's logic, but it's not really something that was laid out by Jesus that's like, you have to do this in your churches?
That's a good way of thinking through even in verse 16. Now, Paul is authoritative as an apostle. We understand that. He is writing this, but even in this book alone, we've already seen him not distance himself from Jesus per se, but say, I'm giving you what I think is wise living. This is not so much what Jesus has laid down as you must, you can't type of a thing. So that's a helpful way to think through it. That didn't directly answer Doug's question, but at least it was helpful to provide some factors to it. At least I don't think it did. Okay, Christine. It was good stuff.
Well, I had my hand up before you said that. I don't think I'm going to directly answer it either. Because mine was more of a question off of Paul's.
Okay.
Is the practice in 16, the no such practice, is that being contentious or wearing the head covering? What is the practice we don't do?
That is a good question.
Or both, I don't know.
It is a fair question to look at verse 16 and say, is the no such practice the dismissing the head covering things, right? Or is it being contentious? Right? I am tempted to not answer it, but I do think that what Paul is getting at is we have no such practice, meaning the churches have been practicing in ways consistent with what I'm outlining here. Correct. Does that make sense? Yes? No? That doesn't make sense?
Because it says we have no such practice. So if he's saying the churches have been doing this, then why does it say no such practice? I'm mixed up.
If you're going to be against what I'm saying, we have no such practice, neither do the churches, meaning you're going against what me and the other churches are doing.
Against it is
yes.
the thing to not do.
Yep. Does that make sense?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. So that doesn't directly answer Doug either, but it is good. It's good to think through. Anybody else want to try to? April does. April and then Kathy want to try to answer Doug's question. So the elephant in the room is, why are you all ladies not wearing shawls? Y'all.
I think probably with shawls, my answer would be, would it communicate today what it communicated then? Oh, with shawls, I would say definitely not, because then people would just be like, what's going on? You guys are weird. Or we'll communicate, that we're a part of one of those organizations that does cover women for other reasons. It would be more confusing if with the shawls and that kind of thing, I would think. With the long hair, I think probably you're just looking at what kind of hairstyles do women wear, but like I don't have an answer for the hair thing, I guess, as much.
Yeah.
But for the shawls, I think, because the whole point is to communicate clearly.
Exactly.
In a cultural way.
Yep.
A shawl would not communicate clearly. It would obscure things.
Yes.
So.
Doug, does that make sense? Yes? I endorse that answer. Yes, I do. But whether I endorse it or not, does that make sense? Meaning the logic applied to this text says wearing a shawl, insisting on the shawl, is not doing what Paul says was doing in this day and age, in his particular context, right? So we need to do in ways that are fitting and appropriate today that still does what Paul's saying should happen within a church, but it might be a different expression. Does that make sense? Okay? Kathy,
I agree.
you agree? Okay. Jason does not. No, just teasing. Jason Stalkup down in front. He's going to play devil's advocate.
I agree. I do agree. I was going to further answer Doug's question. Well, there's two aspects to it. One, I grew up, I don't know if my church as a whole believe this, but I think I've heard this from people in the church I grew up in that their answer to this is, it's not shawls, it's long hair. Therefore, girls have long hair, guys have short hair. We're fulfilling this text. No problem. For the most part, no problem. So that's one solution to it,
Yes,
is
correct.
that all the ladies in this room are obeying this passage. But if it is shawls, then we run into another issue. Going further to the aspect of baptism, why we adhere so strictly to the mode of baptism, like we still practice baptism by immersion, even though it may not carry the same cultural weight of identification that it did in the first century. We, in a sense, re-communicate and reteach what baptism means, and we practice it. So we have to do the legwork of teaching people what it means before we even do it. Is that the baptism was in the Great Commission, Jesus very expressly communicated it as, this is something you have to do. And there's not the command by Jesus, and there's also not the setup in the sense of this is something that all saints, all Christians are to do. It does seem, as you approach this text carefully, that Paul is addressing this as a kind of a weird, funky cultural thing going on, and he's trying to walk through the weeds with people of what it means, why you should do what he's saying to do, and kind of some of the significance there.
Yes. And I do commend Doug the question again. It's not a bad question. It's a good question that you think through. And I commend being humble and respectful in working through this. A person could be too hoity-toity and arrogant in approaching this sort of text or this issue, and I don't commend that at all. So one parallel that seems not as fraught with a whole lot of difficulty, we just kind of toss it out. On a number of occasions, more than just one passage, Paul says, this is an imperative. Greet one another with a holy kiss. That is a command. This is not a command in the same way that is straight up grammatically a command. And he says it more than once. How many of you are doing that? Do any of you feel bad about that? Right? Well, you guys are married. You can do that, okay? But in many ways, it seems a little bit easier and simpler, but we end up doing a similar thing with that we do with this. And maybe we kind of have naturally done that without even thinking. We're like, well, that was cultural. They demonstrated that they greeted one another and welcomed one another and cared for one another by a kiss. We don't do that in America. We could. Well, yeah, you could if you wanted to. But what is a in-kind, appropriate demonstration that we say, I'm greeting you. I'm inviting you into my life, and I want you to invite me into yours. And the raw details of all of this include, you can do the act and not mean it. I mean, so there's more layers beyond this than simply, are you fulfilling this? I mean, how many ladies, if you took the passage that is talking about long hair, how many ladies could say, check off, I've got long hair, and actually be demonstrating the rest of their conduct that I'm not in submission to my husband? Do you get what I'm saying? On the other hand, if you took that this was a shawl, how many women have you seen wear shawls who aren't walking in distinct submission to their husband? I've seen that before, right? So simply that you adhere to this practice isn't all there is. So similarly, you could have this raw routine of we kiss people on the cheek, but then you're gossiping behind everybody's back all the time. That's not hypothetical. That actually happens. How many times have you, what's the history of the handshake? To let people know you don't have a sword, you're not going to stab them, but how many still shake people's hands with bitterness in their hearts? So keep that in mind too, right? That we do need to think carefully through the practice, and what we do means something, it communicates something, but that's not all there is to. And for a church like this, boy, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on too, right? Did I see another hand? Go ahead.
Well, I think technically you just said it, but I was just going to share that that's the thing that I just went, whoa, over, was because, like, if it was culturally the way that they demonstrated, a person could walk into a room and see these people are all in yielded submission to the authorities in their lives. How do we, I just kind of thought, well, how do we all in this room, how are we showing that we're yielded to the authorities in our lives? And it's like, I'll speak for me and women since I am a woman, but are the conversations that all of us wives having when, prayer time is over, are we wearing shawls in those conversations? Yeah. Are we, and for even the single women, you have shawls to wear too. If people come into our church and they're talking to us and they're watching us interact with each other, whether it be spouses or men in leadership positions or just each other, are we demonstrating that kind of care that these shawls in their culture demonstrated? And I was like, ooh, snap. And then it's the other thing that I thought that was interesting was even, because I think you said it or someone said it, but the idea of how just the fact that even how we portray ourselves is an act of community. Mm-hmm. What I choose to put on or do with how I show up to church demonstrates that I am thinking of the others around me. In high school, I went through a streak where I wore sweatpants and a hoodie every Sunday to church, and I was embarrassed by it for a lot of reasons looking back. But even a new level that I'm now getting is I wasn't demonstrating a care for the people around me in that way by actively saying this is my community, and even down to what I wear is integrated with them.
That's a good thought, Katie. In a parallel scenario would be the issue of modesty. How many people, and I would say the well-intentioned older women, think that modesty is a huge issue and think that modesty as a huge issue is basically only that you're not showing cleavage. Biblically speaking, modesty is way more than that, right? Modesty includes, are you drawing attention to yourself, right? So you could be perfectly not showing anything and be very immodest. And Paul even extends this further or deeper by saying, it's the heart. Is your heart modest? Really, modesty is a cousin, not a kissing cousin, a cousin of humility. They go together. Right? So that's another issue to think through. Certainly, there is an aspect to, I should not bring undue attention to the femininity of other male eyes. That's legitimate, but it's not just that. There's much more involved. So I want to open this up. Might as well, since we've already blown past 7:30, let's do this, okay? As much as possible to be careful. And this is where we could end up stepping on toes a little bit, okay? How could we see the theology of this text, what Paul is saying, how could we see that faithfully expressed? And maybe just use yourself as an example. What could it look like today? Or maybe, how is it looking in good ways already, right? Does that make sense? What could it look like to say, let's take this and apply it to real life today? So regardless of long hair or shawls, taking what Paul is saying as, am I demonstrating that I fully understand and support commend that God has made me who I am, and I'm living distinctly like that, especially husband-wife relation within a church family. What are some ways that that could be expressed? What are some ways is it being expressed in a good way? Anybody want to take a stab? Jordan.
I only bring it up because it actually is hair, and so I think it kind of ties in. But when I cut mine short, I actually had several women here, which is a good thing, but they were like, "What did Josh say when you asked him about it?" Which I thought was a great question, and I had asked him.
Yeah.
You know, I had said, "Hey, when we met, it was short. Like, what did you think? Did you like it?" But I thought it was interesting that so many women here, it wasn't like, "Oh, do you like it?" or "I like it." It was, "What did your husband say when you asked him first?" Assuming that I had. So I was like, "Whew, I did." I was like, "Yeah." But it was one of those, I think that even that, in a sense, can demonstrate that submission to authority, and even a sense of attraction to the right person or for the right person. You know, if you don't like this, I don't want to do it. Even if all the other women love it or it's super popular, you know, that kind of thing. So I only brought it up because it actually was hair. And I've heard several conversations within our congregation of things like that, of women saying, you know, "Hey, do you," or, you know, sometimes even when we're getting the girls dressed, and I'll go, "That's looking like it might not be fitting you. Can you go ask Dad real quick?" Because he has a man's perspective. So I'm like, "I don't know, it's looking a little short." And he'll be like, "Yeah, it's quite short." "Oh, okay, take it off, girls. You can't wear it," you know, "We'll pass that one down." So, you know, just stuff like that, of even recognizing the strength that the man can have, that maybe, like, I'm not seeing this a certain way, or to me, I didn't think this looked bad, but okay, if you do, yeah, we definitely can't.
Yeah.
Let, you know, even like kind of submitting to that I don't see it that way, but, you know, you do, and that's a good thing, you know, that, I don't know.
I hadn't even thought of that, but that's a fantastic example. And whether you're saying this or not, I think it demonstrates that a particular community ends up creating its own culture, right? Where there was this, you said more than just one person said this. So there's at least a cultural expectation that, did you give due consideration to your husband in that? Smile, smile, right? And that's great. That's fantastic. Good. Did I see another hand?
I think sometimes as women, we, because of having a mothering role, we like to be in charge. And I think showing submission in that respect means that you don't have to be the center of attention. And giving up your opinion to leadership is sometimes very wise. Well, it's always wise. Not that your opinion doesn't count, and not that you're less important, but learning to submit to that, especially in church leadership. We all want our opinion, and it's very hard to not voice that, but there's other ways of working together besides being the center of attention and wanting to be an authority.
Yeah, very good. And Kathy, what I appreciate about that is you're talking not about hair or dress, but in how we conduct ourselves, how we behave, right? That honors what Paul is talking about, is the undergirding foundation of this. Very good. Daniel, I think, did you, yes, no? Yes? Okay. Then Nate, and then Craig, was that a hand? Great.
Maybe this is to my shame, but I have no idea how in the assembly of the church guys are supposed to demonstrate we are appropriately over our wife, singular, one wife. And and appropriately under Christ. I don't know how we do that. It's easy to look and say, oh, yeah, well, we've thought about women having long hair. We thought through that issue. But for guys, it was just, in this case, they said it was shameful for a man to have his head covered, in that context at least. But what does that look like for guys here? Like, I know we have a male pastor, and that's clearly laid out in Scripture. But beyond that, I don't know what that looks like for me.
That's a legitimate question. It's a good question. I might answer that. We'll see how Nate and Craig do, okay?
This may tie into what Daniel was saying, but the flip side of what Kathy was saying then. So I think for us then as husbands or as males within the assembly, but especially husbands and who have a wife who have their own opinions, have their own perspectives, have their own needs and things like that, if we're thinking of this head word as authority, leadership, protection, representation we talked about, so the same thing. So then I rightly consider my wife, her perspective, her needs, what might be best for her, and I rightly represent that on her behalf. Maybe connects, to some of the other passages of Paul's that are tricky, that the woman should be silent, those kinds of other tricky passages. I think it maybe connects even with that, and so maybe partially answers Daniel's question there as well, that if we as husbands within the gathered church have already rightly considered our wives in whatever matter there might be, and then we rightly represent that and give, due attention to it, whatever.
Very good. Very good, Nate. And admittedly, this text ends up weighing on the side of addressing the women more than men, but it is a legitimate question to think through. Very good. Craig.
In my comments, maybe I'm finishing up my 6-year term as a deacon, but as I think of deacons and the wives and how they support us, just a practical example, as I think of the tasks I need to do as a deacon, such as lead small group at our house, I think about the task where Joelle often thinks about how people are going to be welcomed, how can we make the setting appropriate for the whole, the kids, everybody involved. So thinking broader, and even our work with Dick and Judy this past couple weeks, moving them to a new place, I was very task-oriented. I got to get a truck, we got to get things over, where Joelle was thinking, how is this affecting Judy? How can our efforts be involved more on the emotional side?
Yeah.
So working together, I think it's a teamwork thing.
Yeah, and that, I hadn't thought of that either. And all of this is kind of like ripple impact from the theology of a passage like this, but to recognize you are not wrong, Craig, to put it in these terms. You are not wrong in exerting your masculinity and being task-oriented, but to show due consideration for the value in the almost just as much importance of having the relational side there. And how does a man rightly support that, right? So that's good. And you rightly support that by not saying, well, I can't be about tasks then, right? But to support this and affirm this. That's good. And I don't think we're not this, but to continue to be a church that rightly extols and affirms God's designed distinction between male and female. I mean, He's designed that they work together well. So to be a church that leverages that well and not one trying to say, no, it's all here or all there. My wife has a classic line that she often shares with young women, and she's like, when you're looking to be married, don't try to make the man be your girlfriend. Some of you have heard that sort of line from my wife, because it is so, I'm not a woman, I know that, but what she tells me that is so easy to do for a woman, for a girl, to just look to this guy as being just like maybe the best girlfriend on steroids type of a thing. I'm sorry, it's not going to happen for him to be a man. He can't be that, right? Best friend, sure, whatever, but girlfriend, nah, not at all. Not at all. Good. Hey, good stuff. If there's more, chat with me, chat with one another. Let me close in prayer. Good time together this evening in God's Word. And with that, we can finish verse 16. and move on to the rest of the chapter next time. Father, thank you for your kindness and your grace to me and to us as believers in Jesus Christ, as brothers and sisters. Father, we have no shame in calling brothers brothers and sisters sisters, because there is no shame in being who you've made us to be as male and female. Father, thank you for how you have designed humanity and how you have designed us and how you have placed us together as a local church. God, we in many ways, as much as we dove into this text, there's so much more to think about and to work out and to have you work in us by your Spirit. And so I pray that that would continue. Give us wisdom and understanding as we would not only seek to be in the Word, but let it do its work in us so that we are changed to be who you want us to be. God, I'm so grateful for my brothers and my sisters. Thank you for our time together in the Word this evening. Bless them, Lord. And we know, Lord, you know all of the various burdens and challenges that lie on our hearts. Lord, even hearing about Dick and Judy, Lord, we do pray for those who have been in times of transition or great difficulty or one and the same, those who are going through times of great upheaval, whether it's sickness, whether it's loss, whether it's relational conflict and tension, whether it's transitions in life like moving. Lord, even thinking of Annette Cato and the loss of her mom, not far on the heels of the loss of another relative. Lord, I pray that you would bring the appropriate peace and encouragement to these individuals. And Lord, use us in their lives as is appropriate to bring encouragement and care. God, we love you. We thank you for all that you do for us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you. You are dismissed.